Right, we come to the urgent question. Alex Burghart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland if he will update the House on the likely impact of EU tariffs on the US on the Northern Irish economy.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question. As the Prime Minister has said, tariffs are not good news for anyone, and no one wants a trade war. The government is doing everything possible to keep Britain secure during this new era of global instability, and it will always act in the best interests of businesses in Northern Ireland. As part of our customs territory and internal market, Northern Ireland exporters are facing a general 10% US tariff and a 25% tariff on steel, aluminium and cars, like other exporters across the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland is not, therefore, uniquely disadvantaged. We are, of course, preparing for the EU's next move and any possible retaliatory tariffs that they may or may not introduce, as well as considering the impact new EU tariffs would have on Northern Ireland businesses importing from the United States of America, because under the Windsor framework, the EU tariff would apply. As honourable members will know, however, because of the Windsor framework, businesses can reclaim any such tariff through the existing duty reimbursement scheme in cases where US imports into Northern Ireland do not then enter the European Union. The customs duty waiver scheme also allows duties to be waived entirely, subject to an overall limit. These schemes work in our national interest, and HMRC is continuing to talk to and support any businesses that might be affected to help them understand how to use the duty reimbursement and customs duty waiver schemes. The Minister for the Cabinet Office has talked about all this with EU counterparts in recent days, because the government is fully aware of how sensitive this issue is for businesses in Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, what we need in these circumstances is a calm and considered response, and that is what the government will continue to provide.
So, Secretary of State Alex Burghart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you also for granting this urgent question. It's incredibly important that this House has the opportunity to question the government on this issue before the Easter break and before the implementation of these tariffs. I have to say at the outset, I have enormous respect for my opposite numbers in the Northern Ireland office, but it is totally unacceptable that we should have gotten to this stage in proceedings without a minister coming to the House to update us on the likely impact on businesses in Northern Ireland of this emerging tariff war between the US and the EU. And this is coming, as the House will know, off the back of considerable damage done to the economy in Northern Ireland by the budget last year, by the increases in national insurance contributions, and by the changes to national minimum wage, which have completely undermined business confidence and which are driving unemployment in the region. So look, I ask the right honourable gentleman to answer the following three questions. The first is, has the government by now, a week on from the United States announcement and sometime after the EU's publication of a 99-page of draft tariff responses, has the government done an impact assessment of what this means for the Northern Irish economy and for businesses in Northern Ireland, and will he publish it? Second, he mentions quite rightly the duty reimbursement scheme, which would allow businesses importing, taking goods from GB to NI, having to pay the EU tariff to reclaim that tariff. That scheme is now going to be put under enormous pressure. It's going to have to deal with volumes not foreseen when it was originally put together. Does the Secretary of State have complete confidence that it is going to be able to reimburse businesses in a timely fashion so as not to disrupt trade? And third and finally, because Northern Ireland remains within the EU's custom code, affected Northern Ireland businesses buying affected goods will have to pay EU tariffs. But the same competitor businesses in GB will not. What is the government going to do to ensure that such businesses are not left disadvantaged and that we don't see serious distortions of trade? And with that in mind, Mr. Speaker, will the Secretary of State confirm to the House that in the event that we see a major diversion of trade, his government will be prepared to use Article 16 of the Windsor Framework, which allows the government to take decisions to ensure that businesses in Northern Ireland are not damaged. It's incredibly important that businesses hear that from the Secretary of State that this government is prepared to protect them in the event that this tariff war creates a diversion of trade for business there.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his questions. I'm slightly surprised by his initial comment because, of course, we touched on this matter in Northern Ireland orals.
Only because I raised it.
Well, indeed, but we touched on this matter in Northern Ireland orals last week, and, of course, the Business Secretary made a statement to the House last week. To answer his questions, of course, the government has been preparing for and looking at all eventualities, but until we know what the EU retaliatory tariffs are, it doesn't make much sense to publish speculation about their potential impact. On the duty reimbursement scheme, I have met with HMRC officials because I agree with him it is very important that the scheme works effectively, depending on the number of Northern Ireland businesses that are affected to reimburse tariff. I would just say, however, that Northern Ireland imports about £800 million worth of goods from the United States of America, which is about 2% of Northern Ireland's total purchases, and therefore that impacts upon his third question. We're going to have to take this a stage at a time. The Prime Minister has made it quite clear that he will do what is in the national interest to protect our businesses and our companies and our economic future. But it is precisely because of the Windsor Framework that the duty reimbursement scheme exists.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tonia Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Now, the EU is currently consulting its member states on the goods it may target in response to the US tariffs. The Secretary of State has spoken about maybe there being no need to make an assessment yet. But in advance of the EU imposing retaliatory measures, has he made any assessment at all, if there's any point? And is he engaging with the European Commission to ensure that the interests of Northern Ireland businesses and consumers are fully taken into account in determining how the EU responds to the US tariffs?
Well, as I indicated in answer to the opposition spokesperson, of course the government has been preparing for all eventualities. But as I also indicated, there's no point in publishing something that is not based on the actual tariffs that the EU itself decides to impose. Therefore, it is sensible to wait until that moment arrives. Secondly, the EU will take such action as it determines is in its interests in response to the 20% tariffs that the United States of America has imposed on the EU, in addition to the tariffs on steel, aluminium and cars, and because of the Windsor Framework, which, let us not forget, gives Northern Ireland businesses unique access to the European market, which is not something that's enjoyed by businesses in the rest of Great Britain.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Dr Pinkerton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Financial Times reported at the weekend, and I think, as the Secretary of State has just confirmed, in the event of EU retaliatory tariffs, imported goods from the United States into Northern Ireland will, by default, be effectively forced down the red lane. And that, of course, means additional customs checks, time, red tape. And in the event of their imposition, EU tariff rates for goods coming into Northern Ireland, irrespective of their ultimate destination. And that risks a scenario where Northern Ireland importers are penalised more than almost any other business in either the UK or the EU, first at the border and then in administering the reclamation of those costs. Let us be clear, this chaotic situation is entirely the consequence of Donald Trump's destructive trade war. So can I ask the Secretary of State, what is the government doing to ensure that President Trump and the US administration are alert to the deeply unstabilising and destabilising effects of their tariff policy on the Good Friday Agreement and on the prospect of peace in Northern Ireland? And what active steps is the government taking to mitigate potential disruption to Northern Ireland businesses who now find themselves unwittingly caught up in Donald Trump's trade war? Thank you.
State.
Well, the single most important thing we can do for those businesses in Northern Ireland is to make sure, as I indicated a moment ago, that the duty reimbursement scheme works speedily and effectively, provided those businesses can demonstrate that the goods are not moving into the European Union. for obvious reasons, because otherwise Northern Ireland would become a backdoor to goods that were seeking to avoid the retaliatory tariffs. I would say to the honourable gentleman that the government will take all steps that are necessary to protect British businesses in the very difficult circumstances that we're facing, including continuing to seek to negotiate an economic deal with the United States of America, which is something we've been engaged on for some weeks now. It remains to be seen what may come out of that, but it is part of the calm and considered approach that the government is taking.
Katrina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The complexity of trade relationships on the island of Ireland are a result of Brexit. The importance of working both north-south and is as important as working east-west. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that strengthening relationships, not just with the European Union, but also the Republic of Ireland government, can put Northern Ireland into a pivotal position to navigate this new uncertainty?
Well, I say to my honourable friend, we are all having to navigate this new uncertainty as a result of the decision that the US administration has made. It is certainly true that leaving the European Union has created new complexities, and the reason there is a Windsor framework is because there are two entities, the United Kingdom and the European Union, with different trading rules, but an open border. And therefore, some method had to be found to deal with the consequence of that. And as I've said to the House before, trying to wish away that basic fact hasn't really worked.
Sir Julian Lewis.
It's really important that we keep cool. It's really important that we keep cool heads, and there will be attempts subsequent to my question to relitigate the Brexit wars. The fact of the matter is that the 2019 Brexit deal and the Windsor Framework give Northern Ireland a unique competitive advantage, 10% exports and access to the single market. Can I ask the Secretary of State if he could look, as a Shadow Secretary of State has implied, at a rapid automatic reimbursement scheme, because I think that scheme is the centre of easing tensions should there be retaliation on the EU side?
Well, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right about the benefits that the Windsor Framework has given businesses in Northern Ireland in terms of access to the EU market. I would just say to him, rapid automatic doesn't quite square with the need for the businesses in Northern Ireland that are importing American goods in the eventuality of EU retaliatory tariffs, because they do have to demonstrate that they're not then moving on to the European Union, and that does require them to provide evidence to HMRC in order to get the tariff reimbursed.
Scott up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his statement. And of course, this situation is a reminder that the people of Northern Ireland were right to oppose Brexit in that referendum, absolutely right. And I'm really disappointed that the opposition started their response to this statement by complaining about the lowest paid workers in Northern Ireland getting a pay rise. Absolutely incredible. But the Minister touched on the trade negotiations between the UK and the United States. Can he reassure us that the situation in Northern Ireland is absolutely at the heart of those negotiations?
Well, I'm very happy to assure my honourable friend that the interests of all parts of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, are uppermost in the minds of all ministers in trying to deal with the situation we now find ourselves in.
Samuel Wilson.
The Secretary of State has said that the EU will take action in relation to tariffs in what is its best interests. But businesses in Northern Ireland expect this government to take action in what is the best interests of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. And he talks about, well, this can be all resolved by the reimbursement scheme. The fact of the matter is the reimbursement scheme has failed. There is masses of information to be produced by businesses. There are delays in payment. Some businesses are waiting for hundreds of thousands of pounds of money to be reimbursed in terms of taxes. So that is not the answer. The answer surely is that the EU or the UK collects the taxes which we impose on American goods and leaves it up to the EU to collect their taxes if they wish to impose them.
Well, I would say to the right honourable gentleman in response to that that what he has just proposed ignores the reality that faces Northern Ireland as a result of the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union and the fact there was a problem that had to be solved. And the existence of the duty reimbursement scheme owes the fact of its existence to the Windsor framework itself. It is very important, as I've said to the House, that the scheme works effectively, but businesses do need to provide the information to demonstrate that the goods have not then subsequently moved into the European Union for reasons I think the right honourable gentleman would understand.
Lincoln Job.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm particularly concerned about the cash flow in the small businesses in Northern Ireland in the event that the EU increases their tariffs. In his discussions with the HMRC, has the Secretary of State established what the average waiting time is for the duty reimbursement scheme to kick in? And is there any prospect of foreshortening that if the quantum of amount of money which is out of the door increases in the event of EU tariffs?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman raises a really important point for businesses in Northern Ireland, and as he would expect, I have had precisely that discussion with HMRC. The honest answer to the question, how long does it take? It depends how quickly businesses can provide the necessary information to demonstrate that the goods have not, that they've remained in the United Kingdom and have not moved to the EU. And once that is provided, then the scheme should work effectively. It may help him, however, if I just point out that the custom duty waiver scheme, which is in a separate scheme, does allow up to €300,000 per company over a 3-year rolling average, which will obviously benefit small businesses. And if they come within that heading, then they don't have to pay the tariff up front.
Colin Lockhart.
Mr. Speaker, sadly today I have heard nothing to give businesses in my constituency of Upper Bann any reassurances that this UK government is prepared to protect them. I recognise it's not good practice to comment on speculation, but it is and would be good practice to leave businesses in no doubt that this government, their government, whom they pay hefty taxes to, will protect them from EU tariffs. We cannot be left in a scenario where businesses are relying on a duty reimbursement scheme which doesn't work. It's taking months to get repayment, so I'd ask the Secretary of State to give more clarity to businesses in Upper Bann that he will protect them.
Well, I've done my level best, I say to the honourable member, to set out what the situation is, and we all understand the reasons for them, because Northern Ireland gains from the Windsor framework because of its access. Well, it does gain from its access to the EU market that other parts of Great Britain do not enjoy, but there is a consequence, which is what we're discussing in relation to the imposition of tariffs by the United States of America, which is a decision that the US administration has taken, and all of us are going to have to deal with the consequences. I would also say that HMRC has, of course, been talking already to businesses that might be affected to make sure that they do understand how both the tariff reimbursement scheme and the custom duty waiver scheme work.
Robbins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government's advice to Northern Ireland businesses seems to be just keep calm and carry on. Well, Mr. Speaker, that gives an awful lot of uncertainty to small and medium-sized enterprises in Northern Ireland. Could the Secretary of State actually give a little more meat to the bone in regards to what this government is actually doing? Because, as he did say, the EU will take actions in its interests. Those actions may not be in the interests of Northern Ireland businesses or consumers. So what is this government actually going to do?
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman, in the circumstances in which this country and many countries around the world find themselves, we are having this discussion because of a decision that the United States administration has taken. We do not control that. What we do have to seek to control is our response to it. And I have tried to lay out for the House today what the position is, what is available to support businesses who may be affected by the EU tariffs once we understand what they are, and we will see how extensive they may or may not be, and then businesses will start to work out for themselves what is the consequence and how can we use the mechanism that is in the Windsor framework of the reimbursement scheme to get back the money that they have to pay in a tariff.
Speaker, businesses do require clarity and certainty. Will the Secretary of State undertake to come back to the House as soon as we have that clarity and certainty, and ensure that the EU understand that open border that he keeps talking about is an unclosable border, and tries to give more certainty to those businesses to develop their business forthcoming in the future.
Well, I would say, notwithstanding what we have been discussing today, given that Northern Ireland imports about £800 million worth of goods from the United States of America, which is about 2% of the total purchases made by Northern Ireland. The rest, the 98% of the purchases, are unaffected by any EU retaliatory tariffs relating to goods that are bought into Northern Ireland. And as I travel around Northern Ireland, there are great business opportunities, lots of investment that is coming in. And as I said to the House last week, Northern Ireland has a higher rate of growth than the UK as a whole and the lowest unemployment.
Jim Ellis.
As Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, is the Secretary of State not embarrassed that he and his government have no control over the tariffs in respect of goods imported into Northern Ireland? And isn't the obvious and inevitable answer to repatriate to the United Kingdom control over trade laws? And what happens if Northern Ireland is used as a conduit by the Republic of Ireland or the EU to export goods to the US? Who checks those goods and where?
So say.
Well, I think I've said to the honourable gentleman before, I wouldn't have started from here myself in relation to the cause that led to eventually the negotiation of the Windsor Framework, which was a huge improvement on the Northern Ireland Protocol. But we don't control the decisions that the United States administration has taken. What we have to do is to make sure that we stand with businesses, including in Northern Ireland, to provide them with support, and a mechanism that allows them to reclaim the tariff is the most practical step that we can take. It's already in place because of the Windsor Framework.
Jim Shutt.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has outlined the case, but I'm afraid he hasn't given any answers, and that's disappointing. The promises made to Northern Ireland MPs that we would not be disadvantaged by any EU retentions. This is clearly not to be the case, and government needs to address this directly. Will the Secretary of State set out, please, what discussions to extricate Northern Ireland from EU rules will begin, and when we can expect to see our interests looked after, as was promised by both the Prime Minister and indeed by the Secretary of State? And I was here for both of those last week, and we got that promise, and today, unfortunately, we don't.
Well, the situation that Northern Ireland businesses may find themselves in if there are EU retaliatory tariffs is a product of the Windsor Framework, which gives benefits, as I've said, to businesses in Northern Ireland, as well as requiring the payment of the tariffs that can be claimed back. I would say the single most important reason for sticking with the implementation of the Windsor Framework is we want to negotiate closer economic relationships with the European Union, including an SPS and a veterinary agreement. And members from Northern Ireland have on many occasions raised the consequences of the current arrangement. Things could be a lot easier if we get that agreement. But as I've pointed out to the House many times before, if we don't honour the last agreement that the United Kingdom as a country signed by the last government with the European Union, how exactly do we expect to get a new agreement, in particular an SPS and veterinary agreement, which would help many businesses in the movement of goods across the Irish Sea?
Right, that completes the UQ. We'll let the front bench change over.